Shabbat Shalom. This is the line of Noah. Noah was a righteous man. He was blameless in his generation. The earth became corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with lawlessness. When God saw how corrupt the earth was, for all flesh had corrupted its ways on the earth, God said to Noah, I have decided to put an end to all flesh, for the earth is filled with lawlessness. Because of them, I am about to destroy the earth. The beginning of this Parashat has always struck me, especially in its language. The earth was filled with lawlessness, and it was so bad, God felt, that God decided to destroy the earth. As Felicia already shared, we know the ending. God flooded the earth, but then determined not to do it again. And the floodwaters that we encounter today, both real and proverbial, are not of God's doing, but of our own. But just because the punishment might not exist in the way it did in the time of the Torah, the notion of lawlessness is something to ponder. What could it have meant? What was the generation of Noah doing that resulted in this? In the JPS commentary on the book of Genesis, written by biblical scholar Nahum Sarna, we read the universal corruption, lawlessness, is further defined as Hamas, and this term parallels the concept of no justice in the book of Job. Elsewhere, it is seen as a synonym of falsehood, deceit, or bloodshed. This is fascinating. There is a connection between falsehood and bloodshed. I think that this makes sense. While one could try to say that a little white lie isn't so bad, we know that a little white lie generally turns into something much deeper. And where there is falsehood, often there is bloodshed. If not literal, certainly in metaphor. In fact, there is a phrase, mitzvah goreret mitzvah, one mitzvah causes another, but aveira goreret aveira, one sin causes another sin. How often have friendships or families been destroyed because of falsehood and deceit? Not to mention countries or our world. Professor Sarna continues, it means in general the flagrant subversion of the ordered processes of law. It may be deduced that Hamas here refers predominantly to the arrogant disregard for the sanctity and the inviolability of human life. When we don't value human life, and no, this is not a commentary on a woman's right to choose. When we don't value human life, we are apt to see floodwaters rising. So we must ask, how do we seek out lawfulness in a world that might be filled with lawlessness? I want to tell you about an experience that I had last Sunday that I was grateful for. I was invited to a relatively small gathering of rabbis and local New Yorkers through the New York Board of Rabbis to see Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She received a humanitarian award from the Board of Rabbis. In this intimate interview led by Rabbi Joe Potasnik, RBG articulated her sense of justice, especially in the context of her Jewishness. The afternoon began with the physical description of her office, which led immediately into her philosophy as a lawyer. She shared how in her office, not only is there a mezuzah on the door, but a piece of art with the words, tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice, you shall pursue. Generally, a repetition of a word in our Tanakh is meant to show importance. So certainly the word tzedek being repeated twice shows us the importance of justice. I believe that is the case, but I actually think there's a little bit more, which I'll come back to in a few moments. Following the description of her office, she reminded us that she believes that the law exists to serve all people, and that her heritage as a Jew and her occupation as a judge fits together perfectly. She said, "I am a judge. I am born and raised and proud of being a Jew. And the demand for justice through Jewish history and tradition is what links the two." She shared that in all her years, she wants the strength and the courage to remain steadfast in service of that demand, in service of lawfulness. She reflected on the challenges of finding a job in 1959 because she automatically had 3 strikes against her. She was Jewish, she was female, and she was already a mother. Talk about lawlessness. There was a time when people could come to Columbia University Law School and say, only men should apply. But she persisted and never looked back. And she kept going. She kept her view of the Constitution as a living document in the forefront of her understanding of how to keep our society lawful. As she said, who would want to be governed by a dead document? And why does she believe it's a living document? She said, just look at how it's evolved. Certainly the people who wrote, "We the people," in order to form a more perfect union, were not talking at that time about the important expansive nature of all Americans. It was referring to white male property owners. But as the laws evolved and expanded, it didn't result in lawlessness or corruption, but more people engaged in civic life. As she said, the genius of the Constitution is that we, the people, have expanded to include those who have been left out at the beginning. To me, this is also how we understand Torah. We read black letters on white parchment, but it is the white space between the letters where we have added new voices and new interpretations in a living document of Torah. We are sadly seeing a sense of lawlessness in how people are in relationship to one another when they don't see eye to eye. So it was amazing to hear her talk about her relationship with Justice Scalia. She was asked, how can 2 people who are so different be so close? She, with a bit of humor and a little bite, shared that she would speak with him as she entered through a glass ceiling to help him out of a dark room. When prodded, "Why do you want to help him? He is your enemy," she responded, "He isn't my enemy. We are different, but we are one. Different in approach, but one in reverence for the Constitution and for the institution that we both serve. This is how we understand lawfulness in a world of corruption." Rabbi Shmuel Avigdor HaKohen raises an interesting question concerning the character of Noah. Why is Noah not counted amongst our forefathers? Because the text qualifies that Noah was righteous in his generation. So how are we to understand this superfluous phrase? While some rabbis try to explain this qualifier to the benefit of Noah, saying that if he was righteous in the generation of evildoers, how much more so would he be righteous in later generations, there are others who profess a radically different reading. Given that people were so wicked in his generation, comparatively speaking, he was a righteous individual. So perhaps he showed an ounce of loving kindness more than his fellow human beings. He may have been considered righteous in his time, but not necessarily in later time. In fact, he did not, according to the Torah itself, make any attempt to save his fellow human beings. He was silent, except in the building of the ark for himself and his family. Noah follows God, but he doesn't do anything for God. However, with regard to Abraham, who we see at the end of this week's Parsha, the Torah declares that God said, "Walk before me," meaning Abraham was capable of blazing his own path, not caught up in what was. Like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, he could forge ahead, forging a new path filled with lawfulness. Far from relying solely on God, Abraham recognized that with clarity, that which is godly and moral and ethical. So how appropriate is it that in this Parsha, Noah, we see the introduction of Abraham, Avram, eventually the first Jew? What do we learn from this? We learn that out of lawlessness can come lawfulness. Out of pain, we can see glimmers of hope. It also means that if we are going to be truly engaged as Jews, we must understand the essence of what it means to be human. And that means caring for one another, not engaging in falsehood or deceit. Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Justice, justice, you shall pursue. Not just for one group, but for many. It is why the word needs to be recited twice. Lawfulness needs to be expansive as tzedek to help bring people in. And it is why it needs to be active. And it is why I will conclude with a prayer written by Rabbi Ayelet Cohen, a prayer for our country, so apt as it looks at an expansive nature of justice. O God and God of our ancestors, bless this country and all who dwell within it. Help us to experience the blessings of our lives and our circumstances, to be vigilant and compassionate and brave. Strengthen us when we are afraid, and help us to channel our anger. Help us motivate to action. Help us to feel our fear. Help us to be generous with others so that we raise each other up. Help us to be humble in our fear, knowing we are vulnerable as we feel those at greater risk. Help us in our holy work to stand with them. Help us to taste the sweetness of liberty, to not take for granted the freedoms won in generations past or in recent days. Help us to heal and nourish our democracy, that it may be like a tree planted by the water, whose roots reach down to the stream. It need not fear drought when it comes. Its leaves are always green. Shabbat Shalom.